Right. Good afternoon. People still logging in. I can see the attendee count rising. Let me just say a few words of welcome and introduce myself for this CECAN webinar this afternoon. My name's Dr. Paul Brand. I've had connections with CECAN right back to when it started, doing a lot of workshops and things for them. And some of you may know us. We do a lot of consultancy in the policy and evaluation area and things to do with systems thinking and evaluation and complexity. Today's webinar has possibly the longest title I've seen on a CECAN webinar, Integrating Health, Wellbeing, Nature and Sustainability, HWNS, into Local Strategic Planning, Learning from the Co-Development of a Practical Systems Approach to Placemaking. And we're very pleased to have Jemma Sharman with us to present on that, and I'll introduce Jemma in a moment. I do need to introduce I have a dual interest in this. I'm not only chairing the webinar today, but actually have had a role behind the scenes with Natural England developing the work that Jemma is going to talk about. So I'm slightly wearing two hats today. We have an hour. Just a bit of admin before we start and introduce Jemma. If you get trouble with logging in or anything like that, please email CECAN, and Gail, who's sitting in the background, will pick up on that. The chat window in Zoom is not enabled, but you should find on your menus the Q&A window is enabled. And we'd encourage you to record questions in there, either when we get to the question session, but you can do it during the presentation as well. And then you can also have that Q&A window open, and if you see an interesting one, you can upvote it. And when we come to the final part of the session, when I'm taking Q&A, we'll probably take the questions in the highest upvoted ones first at that time. We will finish on time. The webinar is being recorded and will go up on the CECAN website after we have finished. So if people who wanted to be here and couldn't, they can watch it, or you can rewatch it. But just to note that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded. So just in case there's anybody here who doesn't know what CECAN is, I'm sure a lot of you will do. CECAN stands for the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus, which I always have to look up and remember what the 4 items of the nexus are. It's this composite thing for trying to do work across the policy areas of policy and evaluation of food and energy, water and environment, and trying to actually deal with the complexity of working across those domains, rather than saying it's all too difficult and putting it aside and simplifying the problem down until it's tractable, instead trying to actually grasp the complexity and make those policy and evaluation discussions happen with the understanding that there is complexity and how it might affect things. And CECAN's moved on from being a 5-year research program to now being an entity that continues to talk about and organize events in this space. So to Jemma. Jemma, who I know well, is a principal specialist in the Chief Scientist Directorate in Natural England. And over the last year, she's been taking a lead on this Health, Wellbeing, Nature and Sustainability Framework, HWNS. And she's also the Natural England lead for the wider issues on people, nature, biodiversity, renewal, being applied through a research program for the University of Exeter and the National Trust called Renew. Prior to that, until I think just a year ago, Jemma was working in local government in Plymouth, and I think in other local government before that, across a range of issues with relationships to what we're going to talk about today. So there was some similarity in the work she was doing there, and was involved in a systems approach to a number of the projects that she'll talk there. Maybe she'll speak a little more about that where it's relevant. So without any more ado, I think we've done the housekeeping. I'm going to hand over to Jemma, whose slides are already up on the screen. And I'll see you again in about 40 minutes or 45 minutes, and we'll do some Q&A at the end. So over to you, Jemma.
And thank you, Paul. And it's great to have you chairing today. And as Paul said, he's been involved in development of the Health, Wellbeing, Nature Sustainability project far longer than I have. As I said, I only joined Natural about a year ago, but there's been a lot to learn, a lot to pick up. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity today to be able to share the development of the project, as well as how we've been applying the sort of systems approach to placemaking and how we can support and impact that across local authorities. So thank you for the introduction, Paul. As he said, I've come from a local government background, so I am really interested in the role of practice as well, and how this can inform our evidence base, our policy and decision making too. So I'm a believer in taking kind of action and having that action learning approach. So where we are evidence led, but we have enough evidence then to make informed decisions and to test them out in practice. So not waiting sort of the mythical perfect tool, project, situation, whatever that is, but actually guided by the principle that we'll do something that was better than before, and we'll learn from it, and we'll keep going and iterate from there. So as Paul said, the Health, Wellbeing, Nature and Sustainability project is one of the main projects that I'm leading since I joined up at Natural England a year ago. And the work I'm presenting today very much comes from this much more practical application of systems approaches and systems thinking, if you like. So I'm not an academic. I'm very interested in systems practice, and the Health, Wellbeing, Nature and Sustainability project, which I will probably shorten to HWNS, otherwise it'll take my full 45-minute slot in this presentation, was really about actually thinking about how we could support more systems approaches in placemaking that prioritised health, wellbeing, nature and sustainability outcomes. So in terms of today, I suppose the sort of systems thinking about the audience here today is about a mindset, and systems change is our kind of ultimate goal. Then systems practice is about how we get there, and that's what we've been looking at with the HWNS project. So I'll be sharing some background to the co-development of the project, how it came about and why, quite important, but also then the learning that from the initial prototype development and testing that we've been doing with local authorities and our partners, and outlining future plans for how HWNS could start to influence wider local placemaking. So we're still very much in that development experimental phase of HWNS. So I'm looking forward to having thoughts and questions and any other reflections at the end of the presentation today. And I just want to be clear in the title. So local strategic planning that we referred to in that title isn't just about spatial planning, so professional local plan setting. It's about strategic visions for places, and it works across sectors. So it's not just about coming at from a kind of professional planning perspective. It's anybody involved in that strategic vision setting and decision making in that field. So I just want to clarify that before I continue. So before delve in to HWNS project and what it is and what it's doing, I want to just give a bit of strategic context really in terms of Natural England's perspective for the HWNS project and why it came about. So internally in Natural England, in the Chief Scientist Directorate, we work to a science evidence and evaluation strategy that we're currently reviewing at the moment. And a couple of key goals within this that HWNS responds to, which is about using science and evidence to identify strategic opportunities and priorities and innovation and being able to act on them. And also showing that the best available evidence is central to all our decision making, delivery, advice, etc. So naturally we recognise there is often a lot of data, a lot of evidence out there available at different granularity, at different spatial scales, but actually that can be often difficult to make sense of, interpret and apply, particularly at a strategic level, and influence our decision making. And in terms of other strategic context for the HWNS project, but also obviously want to make sure we're aligned with the environmental improvement plan priorities around particularly nature and health, and the environmental improvement plan includes priorities about how we can better join up health and nature recovery planning, and also to be more evidence-led and to look at inequalities and addressing to access to nature as well. So it's kind of clearly referenced in there. And then in an international sense, there is the Global Biodiversity Framework, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And it's interesting to note, amongst another very specific targets within that, but actually there is a really specific target about ensuring that the best available data, information, knowledge are accessible to decision makers, practitioners and the public to guide the effective and equitable governance, integrated and participatory management of biodiversity. It's quite a long sentence, but it is about saying, again, we recognise that it's not just about the evidence, the data being there, it's actually about how we make that accessible and how in a format that people can apply in terms of changing practices, which is ultimately what we want to be doing. So after a little bit of context, I think it's important about we talk about the concept of HWNS and what is it about, where did it come from, what's the problem it's trying to solve. So we know that high quality health and well-being that's supported by a healthy natural environment are the basis for thriving local people and places. Not many people would disagree with that. However, often in local plan making and strategic decision making in a local context, these can often be seen as secondary objectives or sometimes even constraints in the planning process. So instead of being the priority outcomes as a place, they kind of can be tacked on at the end. But we also know that local authorities and other organisations involved in placemaking are really grappling with a huge, challenging range of issues, you know, from nature and climate emergencies to health and well-being crises, health inequalities, etc. And these issues obviously work across disciplines, they work across different sectors, people, places, and therefore require more systemic thinking. So my colleague at Natural England, Tim Sunderland, became quite frustrated about how health and well-being, nature and sustainability were often secondary outcomes in that planning process. I wanted to initiate this HWNS concept to explore how we could develop a framework or a more integrated approach that could support particular at senior level strategic decision makers to consider and better plan for health, well-being, nature and sustainability as the final outcomes for places, and that all other planning strategies, decisions will be working to meet those as the kind of ultimate goal. And so within this kind of emerging concept around HWNS, we want to also see what tools and resources we could provide that could give validated insights on what matters then for health, well-being, nature, sustainability, and then to practically help those senior decision makers and other people involved in those decisions shape local strategies and plans that do allow people, nature, and our wider global sustainable development to thrive and improve. So this is really taking that kind of systems practice approach, really, like what do we need to do to get there? So that often there's a mismatch, not just in the tools that we try to use to solve these kind of complex problems, but also in the mindsets that create them. So I'm sure people here on this webinar today and interested in CECAN's work are interested in. So really at the heart of HWNS was about how can we minimize this mismatch, recognizing we need to change mindsets, we need to look at new tools that might solve some of these complex, more systemic problems rather than reinforce them. So we need those sort of tools and practices that are better suited to dealing with complexity. So taking this kind of very early, quite broad HWNS concept, what can we do in this placemaking setting? We actually took this into a discovery phase, which had an aim about, which had a broad discovery aim in terms of enabling an integrated and collective mindset on HWNS by identifying people, resources, and evidence that could explain the systematic set dependencies. So quite, again, still pretty broad, but trying to look at how we start to encourage thinking beyond kind of silos, more systemic thinking, more systemic practices. And as part of this, Natural England worked with FutureGov, I think back in 2021, to try and bring that concept to life. Recognise we obviously wanted to do this in a co-development way with kind of key partners working as experts in across health, well-being, nature, sustainability domains, and also thinking very early on about who might be the primary audience with this. So obviously we're talking about working in a place-based setting, so having the local authorities, combined authorities involved from the outset. The FutureGov worked with a series of partners and through an advisory group, and as well as having expert matters as well involved in those in that process. And we worked through a series of interviews, focus groups, workshops, like I said, with both those domain experts and potential end users too. And as I say, given that obviously there's quite an early focus on the HWNS concept being about place-based decision making, local and combined authorities were the logical primary audience. Recognising that local governments are the important kind of main actors for setting strategic goals in places and implementing policy to achieve them. And also that they're really important in terms of being monitoring and accountable for results for that plan making process as well. You know, often local governments are seen as the kind of duty bearers, the anchor institutions in placemaking, but of course working with a range of partners and other organisations and sectors to do that. And there are a number of key opportunities identified in the through the discovery phase. So it was actually recognising that through these conversations, the main kind of three elements that came up in terms of opportunities are about facilitating collaboration between anybody who wants to shape local places, making it simpler to understand how to locate evidence in a holistic way, so across those health, wellbeing, nature and sustainability domains, and making it easier to share the evidence and raise awareness in a way that could influence planning and local communities as well. So again, there's still quite kind of broad aims and themes in that initial discovery phase. So essentially, it's really about how could we create a process, a framework, elements, resources that could support conversations and decision making that were able to zoom out, see the bigger picture, but then also could zoom in again and to enable people to take action. So quite a big ask, I'd say. And as I said, we worked with a number of partners to do this. So we've had a formal partnership that's included 4 pilot or local authorities, and a formal partnership with the Environment Agency, with local partnerships, What Works Wellbeing, University of Exeter, and a number of other organisations too. And we've continued to work through this partnership as well in terms of the iterative development of HWNS through this discovery phase and through the alpha kind of prototyping phase that we're just coming out of now. And just a quick note on terminology. During the discovery phase, we did refer to the use of kind of tool development. And when I came in, we were still very much talking about an HWNS tool. But we're working on terminology. You know, language is really important. And I think the word tool can be a bit misleading. We often think about kind of metrics and numbers and putting in something and it coming out with an answer. And actually, really, that isn't what HWNS is about. It is much more about a framework, and that's what Paul referred to at the beginning there. Actually, this how we can frame a better conversation, a more integrated conversation around health, wellbeing, nature and sustainability. So we're working to finalise our terminology around that, but it is really important, and including the name. So we've got a few ideas on the shortlist at the moment, but obviously HWNS is not a very catchy title, so we're working on that as well. And if any ideas pop up throughout the rest of this conversation today, then please do share them with us. So we've sort of taken this initial discovery phase learning. A lot of this has been done on quite a shoestring in terms of very minimal budgets, colleagues' time being put into it from Natural England and across partnerships, but recognising that there was some really valuable conversations and information and kind of processes coming out of this discovery phase. It identified, the discovery phase also identified some key learning points. So in terms of the users, this HWNS, the word tool again is being used here, but the HWNS framework, the resources, the elements need to facilitate collaboration between people who want to shape places. So we've really, we've kind of emphasised that already. In particular, there were quotes coming up about we don't have a shared language, so time is wasted trying to determine if we understand each other, was one of the participants from the local authority, for example. And the tool could have a broad potential user base from, like I said, place-based making, but also looking at potentially in the future how communities could engage better with this, and it could move towards a more participatory decision-making tool. So although initially it's aimed at kind of high-level strategic decision makers, there is a kind of wider future scope there as well. And like I said, the shared language will help also democratise that evidence base so we can understand collectively whether we're professionals working across different disciplines and domains, or whether we're members of the public engaging, that we can actually all understand what we're all saying in a kind of plain English sense. So we're trying to make this really accessible. And that will also then, like I said, level the playing field for those involved from a decision making from more of a community perspective as well, but might lack the resources or the kind of expert knowledge to engage in that process. In terms of evidence, participants were clear that there was a need to simplify how to holistically find that evidence base. So again, we really touched on that it's this product is not about producing in-depth evidence. It's about balancing the complexity of this and the simplicity and signposting to users for that detail if it's required. But this is really about that kind of high-level view. But being able to use that high-level view to gain an insight into how your local area is doing across health, wellbeing, nature, sustainability. And trying to recognise that different users might have different evidence needs, although, yeah, it's always a risk of trying to be everything to everyone is a challenge. And recognising that different people will be engaging this with different levels of background expertise as well. So, yeah, that one-size-fits approach might not fit all. And finally, the findings and discovery phase suggest the importance of the narrative that makes it easier to share evidence and raise awareness in a way that could influence planning, strategic decision making, and local communities. So again, noting that the aim of the tool is not to provide a complete solution, but to generate ideas and help create a narrative that people can engage with, and that these can also be really important in influencing planning processes, strategic decision making, and the knock-on in terms of influencing behaviours, etc. So we need to take then this initial discovery phase scoping and start to develop what this might look like in practice. So what might our initial product could be like. And we also aware that with working in this, we've got this quite aspirational, quite ambitious aim, but minimal budget, and also recognising long term, anything we develop, we need to think about kind of maintenance from the beginning being low cost, as minimal as possible. So some really pragmatic factors in there as well. And as part of that scoping, so we've talked through some of the elements that that from the findings from the discovery phase that were really important in terms of place shaping and accessing evidence that in a really accessible manner. But we also formalised a set of design principles that we wanted for the product as well, in terms of eventually being open to the public rather than it just being exclusive to local authorities or subject matter experts. That was about planning future scenarios over analysing current scenarios, that it was about provoking new thinking over providing the final answers. So that's going back to that point around kind of tools and kind of metrics and calculations that we wanted to stay away from. And it was about high level holistic information rather than that deep domain specific knowledge that I just talked about, and having much more of a qualitative understanding before you start to look at quantitative analysis. So we then took this product scoping into the alpha prototyping phase, which has really been the focus of the last year or so, a little bit longer. The purpose of any alpha phase really is to see if this product could work. So that's what alpha is about. Like, actually, okay, we've got this idea, we've got this concept. Is it workable? Can we start to develop it? Can we test it out? Which parts are going to go somewhere? Which parts aren't? What are the challenges and ongoing learning we're going to have? So we wanted to get towards a point in the alpha that we could have a minimum viable project, if you like. So how does the whole thing, what does the whole thing look like? How does it hang together? And what's going to be possible with it? Does it actually meet the purpose of the original aim that we want it to? So we sort of narrowed down the aim with HWNS as part of this alpha prototyping. It's still pretty broad, but it was really about co-developing HWNS as a high-level interdisciplinary decision support framework that could prioritise health, wellbeing, nature and sustainability outcomes, putting these at the centre of strategic planning conversations as a priority for our outcomes. So we've got, you'll see on one side of the slide, those three domains, and Paul will be very familiar with this, because this is also helping shape up our facilitation framework, which I'll talk about a bit later. And then we've got our three main elements within our HWNS product, I guess, if I want to a better word at the moment. And these core elements that we've got, the digital dashboard, these factor maps and the drivers and pressures, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, are about how we can bring those disciplines together, how we can kind of understand and integrate those interdependencies across health, wellbeing, nature, sustainability, and bridge the gap between technical information and practical solutions. And we've worked particularly closely in this phase with the Environment Agency local partnerships, University of Exeter, What Works Wellbeing, and our pilot local authority. So they've been really closely involved over the last year. So in terms of what this product looks like, I'll give a high-level overview now, and then I'm going to go into a bit more detail so you can see how it all hangs together. So just to reiterate, it's not about calculations. We're not simplifying things to a metric or using weights or judgments. We're framing a conversation that prioritises health, wellbeing, nature and sustainability. So taking all of that information and learning from the discovery phase, we outlined the 3 main elements that I've just touched on. So the first is a dashboard, which are going to be available digitally, and these are about responding to the need for accessible evidence. So these are aimed at giving the high-level insight as to what matters for health, wellbeing, nature and sustainability outcomes. They are not about providing lots and lots of detail. That information exists already. If you want to go through health at your fingertips, you know, for detailed public health data, that's out there already. This is about picking sort of 4 or 5 high-level indicators that are meaningful for those outcomes to give you a snapshot of how your local area is performing across those. And like I said, I will talk a little bit more about those in a moment. We have the factor maps, which are originally called relevant factor diagrams, reflecting that they're not, in an academic sense, systems maps. So we will talk about what they are and what they are not in a little moment as well. But they are about responses that need to enable users to understand systemic dependencies across health, wellbeing, nature and sustainability in that very local context. So they are designed to be used collectively together to work out what actions could better support health, wellbeing, nature and sustainability outcomes. So you could start to look at trade-offs and synergies as well as conflicts of potential multiple benefits, etc. So that was about how we can look at those links and start to enable action. And then a third piece, the drivers and pressures piece that came out was actually about, partly came out of trying to simplify the factor maps a little bit with some of these big overarching drivers and pressures, like for example, climate change. It can start to add too much complexity to those factor maps to be useful. And also that how they would enable participants in an HWNS conversation to start looking more to the future, so that kind of horizon scanning mindset, and also support them to move away from a business as usual mindset too. We also recognised very early on that because this is about changing mindsets and decision-making processes, how this is all used and how it fits together is like everything, the process is key. So this is a big part of what Paul and his team at RiskSol have been involved in, is actually how do we ensure that these elements work together, they are facilitated in an effective framework, and that this is delivered to a high quality. So I think this will be really crucial in the impact that HWNS has. And so we're working on this facilitation framework at the moment, and again, I'll say a bit more about that later, but also then how can we roll this out in terms of training the trainer model. And we're particularly working with Natural England, but also Environment Agency and local partnerships on that element too. And I just wanted to say that HWNS is intended to be used alongside the existing kind of detailed specialist tools and other resources that are out there, and that we'll be signposting those within guidance as well as part of the tool. So if people do want more detail, or then more subject matter experts become involved, that they can be responding to that too. And finally, it's worth saying that in the development of these elements over the last year, we've been trying to set this up in a way that each could be used in its own right and have a useful purpose, as well as then the kind of collective impact that these could have in terms of bringing together the factor maps, the digital dashboard, the drivers and pressures work, and a facilitated framework. So in terms of that alpha prototyping and wanting to see what was possible, that we wanted to make sure that whatever happened at the end of that alpha, we had a useful set of tools and resources that we could be used regardless of the whole project. So I imagine there'll be some people in this audience today that will be familiar with this. So this is the kind of the how and really getting into the nitty gritty. I won't be able to kind of run through everything in as much detail as I would have liked today because of just time constraints, but these are our factor maps. So this is about understanding the dependencies, about enabling people to take more strategic decision-making conversations, And so CECAN were initially a very big part of this, and this is where they started to work with RiskSol as well in developing these through their participatory systems mapping software, which is a free open source secure software that can be used for things like mind mapping and systems visualization that CECAN developed and is made available. So yeah, it's great because it can be used collaboratively and remotely for people that can kind of work on it at the same time. So actually it's a really great piece of software that's come out of there, and we can definitely recommend it. So we ran a series of workshops again with partners, stakeholders across the domains and our end users to map out what factors mattered in relating to those final outcomes across health, well-being, nature and sustainability. So developing those health and well-being as one map, nature as another, and sustainability as the third one. So that we could have a kind of a universal resource to help inform more strategic decision making across those domains. And it's really important to say that these I'll say a little bit about it in a minute, but they are designed to be used collectively as well. And then these are also tested through live case studies with local authorities too. So each factor map contains factors which are relevant to those outcomes. They're organised in high-level groups, and then they're expanded into further detail into the 3 levels of factors that we have there. And on the digital version that we're working on at the moment, each factor will be able to have a pop-up definition related to a URL. And it's really clear that we need to use those 3 factor maps at once, so we can come up with plans obviously that act across health, wellbeing, nature, sustainability. Otherwise we'd be reinforcing silos. So at the moment they're not currently physically linked, although we would like that to be. And one of the tensions with these maps has been trying to develop them in a way that they are accessible. They represent a system in enough complexity to be useful and support that system's practice, but not so complex that then they're just inaccessible and just confusing to people. Some of the work that I've done in the past has actually been about co-developing these maps, and often that the process of developing is almost more important than the actual maps, whereas in this case we're giving people the maps to inform their conversations. So again, the kind of guiding people through that in a kind of skillful and well facilitated way is really important. I just want to quickly touch on what the factor maps are and what they aren't. So recognizing there's a kind of systems audience here today, that and we're really clear that they're not systems maps, but they do show many of the key factors that influence outcomes from a local authority perspective. They do provide a hierarchy of the categories and subcategories of factors, and they are designed to provide a framework for discussion, so we can start to collectively better understand what factors influence these outcomes across the 3 maps. Like I said, they provide a simple, quick insight for you to understand factors that could be outside their core area of expertise and to help break down those silos. And we've tried to ensure that they have an accessible language and design so they can be used together as a package, and also by a number of different audiences that might not be expert in these issues as well. And they're not causal maps, so in a kind of traditional system sense. So they don't have any kind of feedback loops on them. They are generic, they're not necessarily specific, and they're based in physical systems rather than policy, recognizing that policy obviously changes quite and can quickly make the maps redundant too. So we wanted to develop something that was as low maintenance as possible. But they don't have weightings on them, and also recognizing they're not necessarily complete. So these will iterate, and as some of our testing shown, people actually want to take some of these maps and adapt them into their local context. For example, if they had more of a kind of coastal area in their local authority. And at the moment, like I said, they don't show links between the different diagrams. That's something we are looking at, and again, is a balance between making things too complex and less accessible. So that's something we're exploring at the moment. And I won't have time to go into some of the pilot workshops that we did, but we run 4 pilot workshops across Liverpool, Greater Norwich, and a couple in different parts of Surrey to test out these factor maps and use the learning from those factor maps to further improve not just the factor maps themselves, but also the wider toolkit. And I'm a bit limited on time today, so I won't cover all the kind of feedback that came from those workshops, but there was a lot of support for the tool itself in terms of how it could support much more of that horizon scanning mindset, inform the kind of policy and narrative development and kind of wider business cases for work. And also that it can act as a process, as a kind of sense check, to check that we haven't missed anything across these domains. Who needs to be involved? What factors haven't we considered? So a bit of a checklist, a bit of a kind of exploration of any gaps that might have been there as well. And start to pull out any, not just about collaborations, but also conflicts that might be arising where groups might be competing for resources or funding, and actually where they might be able to collaborate better. So it started to kind of tease out some of those elements too. And again, going back to the original aim, a lot of the participants in those test workshops were really interested in how it might provide more of a community engagement, participatory element as well in the future. And these workshops also, like I said, enabled us to feed that learning back into the tool and for future iterations. And one of the things that came again strongly out of those workshops is about that need for good facilitation, so people don't get kind of lost in the maps or the wider tool process. So I'm just, I won't talk too much on that. I'm aware of time today, lots to say. And then the third element we talked about that we've been developing through the alpha phase has been the drivers and pressures for local government, which is really about starting to look at that horizon scaling element, but also about how we can take that complexity out of the factor maps, so to keep them quite accessible. I haven't got time to go into each of these today, but we are working, we've developed these with the Natural England's future team in terms of key drivers and pressures for local government, but then also tested them out with local authorities and through one of our partners, Local Partnerships, who are an organisation that are hosted by the Local Governments Association, the Treasury and the Welsh Government. And based on those workshops, there's a kind of whole pack around these kind of 8 key drivers and pressures for local government. They're actually working into a kind of simplified slide deck resource, which develops the sort of so what, the implications piece on it. So what does this mean in terms of our place shaping? What does this mean we need for our local government approach? So, but what it does mean is it has enabled us to simplify the factor maps, and we've been able to take some of these kind of big overarching pressures, like I said, like climate change, for example, or energy security, out of those maps to a certain extent. And the ways in which this resource might be used will depend on the kind of focal question that a user might be wanting to ask, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute. So I wanted to make sure we covered the dashboard because they are an important part of providing accessible evidence across health, wellbeing, nature, sustainability. As I said at the beginning, they're about providing that high level snapshot about how your local authorities are doing across those outcomes. So it's not about a detailed analysis. It's so that a senior decision maker could come and have a look about broadly how are we doing, what's the national benchmarking for this, where could we be putting more of our efforts, what do we need to know more about or unpick, for example, if our life expectancy is going down much faster than the national average. And again, I haven't got too much time to talk in depth about these today. I'm just showing a snip here of our one of our mock-ups from our early alpha prototyping. But the beta versions, we're also wanting to make sure we've got a dashboard that presents a couple of indicators across health, wellbeing, nature and sustainability on one web page. So we're not reinforcing silos by having our dashboards on separate pages, and improving some of the functionality around how we can start to drill down into kind of health inequalities across the health and wellbeing indicators, for example, how we can show the sustainability dashboard showing the impact on our kind of global sustainability footprint, as well as local area impact. And also, Alpha was just about scoping out what might or might not work. We want to really improve the accessibility and usability of those dashboards too. And I have to say, actually, one of the biggest challenges really has been around, well, not just nature, but actually having robust open source data, which we want it to be from a maintenance point of view, available at the right spatial scale, at a local authority scale, has been really challenging. Health and wellbeing has been more possible, but then when you start to go into sustainability and the nature data and what is available at local authority level, it's really interesting to see how limited that is. Another important part of the dashboard is to say we want to present the indicators that we felt were meaningful to these outcomes rather than indicators for the data that we actually had, recognizing that we really then want to be kind of lobbying and working to address those gaps rather than developing indicators that just aren't that meaningful. So there's probably a lot I could be saying about that, but that's for another time. And then a really important part of the alpha prototyping process was finding a host for this. So recognizing if our primary users are local authorities, where are they going to find out about this resource? So local partnerships are really keen. As a partner who already work with local authorities, combined authorities, to host this on their website as part of a broader resource hub they have for their work with local and combined authorities. So this is where we've been working to host the whole HWNS kind of product through the alpha prototyping phase, and hopefully we'll be taking that into beta and improving that experience further. So the eventual goal is that the whole package will be hosted on the local partnerships website, and which will include all of the elements from the dashboards to the factor maps to the horizon scanning work. Plus, we're just starting to work on how we make that coding available on GitHub so that other people can take this, and we make that openly available, and that we also understand how we're going to communicate and open up that facilitation framework as well. So the facilitation framework, which I've touched on, is a really, really important part. Like it's come out of all our kind of workshops and our testing because we're asking people to shift their thinking, their perspective, step outside their disciplines, their comfort zone. We need to make sure that it's managed in a really careful, thorough process. And again, I could talk more about this process because it is so crucial to the impact of HWNS, and Paul's and RiskSol have been a really important part of that. But we're just sketching that out now. We've got a draft facilitation framework and package that we're working on that we can then start to support, particularly Natural England users, Environment Agency and local partnerships on how they can put that into practice. And we start to have a train-the-trainer approach to using that, making sure that there is this sort of effective quality control over it. We are also working within that to actually really take people step by step, starting to think about what their focal question might be for the HWNS products, right through to actually designing and evaluating the workshop too. And University of Exeter are also involved in terms of how we then start to build up case studies and further illustrative examples of how HWNS has been used in practice, including starting to track longer term impact as well. So that's really important to see. Again, is it meeting the original aims? Are we having an impact on local authority, combined authority placemaking, decision making in the short term, and then longer term outcomes as well? So I'm really aware of time, so I'm just going to whiz through the last couple of slides. Like I said, as I said at the beginning, it's a very ambitious concept. You know, it's really about shifting questions and shifting mindsets and priorities in terms of our placemaking, and challenging people to think beyond business as usual and to make decisions in a more integrated, more systemic way. And that's really challenging. And all along we've had to balance this. We're looking at complex issues. We want to encourage people to think about things systemically and about their complexity, but also making sure that any of the components, the elements we produce are accessible too. So that's been really, really important, and it's really difficult to kind of bring about that change. So we've been having to walk that tightrope all along. And like I said, we want to move people beyond thinking about metrics, that this is something we're going to be able to plug in information in. It does some clever calculation and comes out with an answer. We're asking people to develop new ways of thinking, to develop those answers themselves. So that, again, recognizing that need for that facilitation in that process has been really, really important. And how we communicate that is really important. And I think we're sort of just learning that as we go into beta, that actually what are people's expectations of HWNS, and how we can make sure we're clear about that, as well as then meeting those expectations of the product itself. And I think kind of obvious from the start, it's been really important that geographic grounding it in place, grounding in geographical context actually has really been helpful, really useful in people starting to understand how to better systems practice and having those more integrated conversations. So recognise that's a really, really important part as well. And it's been a real challenge in terms of developing the technology in the alpha phase. We've had a kind of shoestring budget, so trying to scope out what's possible with the data that exists, the budget that we have, the resources that we have, has been hugely challenging, and ensuring that we think about that maintenance at the beginning and how we keep that low cost and needs to have kind of minimal updates. So that's the alpha phase has helped resolve some of those questions. We've got a lot more information now, but inevitably it's opened up new questions as well, and we're looking at how we can deal with those as we go into our beta phase. And I said before, I won't cover it again, but that having that data, the right data available at the right spatial scale to have meaningful indicators has been hugely challenging as well. And we recognise that our primary audience has been local and combined authorities, and increasingly, you know, they're in a very challenging space in terms of demands for what they are required to do, and the budget and the resources and capacity to do that too. So we're looking at, they are our kind of primary audience, but how can we support them with some of those challenges as well? And like I said, we're wanting to develop longer term case studies so we can start to track the impact of the HWNS too. So nearly done. Next steps, we've been lucky to secure some funding to the Government Office for Technology Transfer through a Knowledge Expansion Grant, which is great because that is giving us some funding this year to move towards the beta development, further develop the facilitation framework and the training work I talked about, but also being led by local partnerships is how we can start to increase the testing, the uptake and impact, particularly with local and combined authorities and potential other audiences as well. We continue to have those resource challenges, so we'll have to really focus about what's possible and what isn't. And like I said, continue to work on those data gaps that we've got at local authority level and what we might be able to do about those. And I know the Government Office for Technology Transfer are also really interested in that work too. Like I said, we're revising and testing the facilitation package work further and the trainer approach, but we also longer term want to start looking at the possibility for more participatory decision making with this and better accountability across health, wellbeing, nature and sustainability outcomes. So we're probably out of time. It's just worth saying this is all very experimental prototyping in progress. You know, like I said, it's got a grounded in systems practice, but we are learning as we develop and test the HWNS framework, and that's part of our learning too. So I thought I'd finish with a bit of humour. Which is borrowed from an excellent systems practice guide by MTC. So it's a reminder that the purpose at the start of HWNS was about changing those mindsets. And so often the tools we use are often the wrong ones for the job. So we are often meeting complexity with simplicity, and HWNS is part of trying to challenge and address that. So I'd really welcome any of your thoughts, reflections and questions from today. So thank you.
Thank you, Jemma. Thank you so much for all that input. And we do understand this is a work in progress, and so pieces of it are still under development. We have just over 10 minutes for some Q&A here. And I think if we don't manage all the questions, I think we'll take a look at them afterwards and maybe do a mail round.
Yeah, absolutely.
With answers to others. I'm sorting these by most up votes. Hoping you can see them as well, Jemma. The top one at the moment, please feel free to add more questions, even though we don't have that long. Ross Gillard, who is the owner/broker of applying this toolkit in local contexts, and how can this learn from previous similar initiatives to integrated decision making? I'm just going to pop pop your mic on, Ross, but just explain what you've got something in mind about previous initiatives and where they might not have quite worked. I've just popped Ross's ability to speak on. Could you just flesh that out in a sentence or two?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Paul. I was just madly
Let me say where you're from, Ross.
I will. I was madly looking for the unmute button, but you've just answered that riddle.
I think I have the power.
Hi, so I'm an analyst at the Office for Environmental Protection, and so yeah, quite interested in how this work links to the environmental improvement plan, and some of the great stuff you've talked about throughout this presentation really struck a chord with me, particularly around some previous stuff we've done in the OEP, looking at integrated decision making and what tools are out there to support that sort of work. So I suppose my question was perhaps a bit cheeky because there's two parts to it. My first thought was who in local authorities and local contexts sort of is the champion for this. I guess a classic thing that we've learned from these sorts of things in the past is it can fall through the gaps if it's trying to bring together all three different, these three different areas, who leads it and who champions it. And I guess related to that is that broader question of has this project built on lessons from previous such tools? I guess there's myriad examples.
Nice simple one for you to start with, Jemma.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I know.
Thank you, Ross.
Yes, I wasn't personally involved in the discovery phase, but from the work I've seen on that, it was very much taking kind of grounded in practice as well, so taking learning from previous work. In terms of that kind of owner element, what we've tried to do in setting up compiling the kind of digital prototype is set it up in a way that it's pulling through existing information. So for example, the dashboards are, say I take the health and wellbeing one, it's most straightforward, based on ONS data sets. So they're just pulling them through API. We're not kind of creating our own set of anything, if you like. So it's very low maintenance. It's just actually about how we present and visualize that data. So we're picking, for example, like we've got 5 key indicators across health and wellbeing that will pull through from those ONS data sets. So we're not having to kind of host lots of extra work. And because local partnerships are hosting the whole thing on their website, for example, the factor maps will be embedded in their website through kind of our shiny coding. So what we've tried to do all along is not necessarily set up a whole new kind of system or digital process, but actually, like where relevant, pull through existing work, but present it, look at how we can present it. And then the other resources not require lots and lots of constant iteration and maintenance and updating. So local partnerships, eventually the longer term kind of aspiration beyond beta is that obviously they will take on that kind of longer term hosting as an organisation already hosted by the local governments association. So they'll act as that kind of champion rather than it relying on and be working. That's why they'll be leading on their marketing kind of uptake and communications plan with that, is because that's their audience and they want to be supporting that work across local government. Right. Partly, but it'd be good. It would be good to understand more about your work, Ross, as well, in terms of the OEP too. So yeah, I might pick that up with you.
And yeah, there's also another thing just started in OEP, Ross, literally last month, but I don't know how closely it related to this in terms of some system mapping stuff going on. So there were people involved in that. Next one off the vote list is Abby Fowler. Abby, let me just pop you on audio. Just explain. This is kind of about the 5 examples of I think it's give examples of health indicators. Can you just voice that for us, Abby?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, no problem.
Great, yeah, so I'm a public health specialist and I'm really interested in the, well, all of it really, but especially at the start of the presentation, you talked about the selection of indicators that areas can select from, or either using existing local data or accessing national data. Would you be able to, and it is give, not 5, it's a typo, some examples of what they might be, please?
Yes, yeah, so for example, with health and wellbeing, we've built, of course, the ONS data sets around healthy life expectancy of birth, and then around the 4 main wellbeing indicators, so levels of anxiety, levels of feeling life is worthwhile, levels of happiness, levels of life satisfaction. So they're the key ones for health and wellbeing. And then we've done, it's been a bit more complex with sustainability and nature in terms of developing the kind of meaningful indicators, and then the data sets sit behind them. But sustainability is focused around energy use, renewable energy generation, greenhouse gas emissions, waste generation, and material use. And then nature is more complex still, because it's very difficult with nature to, particularly with habitat composition. You can't just look at something like tree canopy cover, because that tree canopy cover could be the expense of a wildflower meadow, for example. So it's been a bit tricky, but the broad we're a bit further behind with the nature dashboard, but it's basically looking at the ecosystem extent and then the condition of that ecosystem. So some of that will be having to take kind of spatial mapping and to visualize that in a more simple way, and then looking at things, for example, like condition of our designated sites and kind of land and sea, water quality, etc. But yeah, I could.
Thank you. We'll
Too much
save a
more
minute or two. Save a minute or two at the end for you, Gemma, to say when you think, you know, stuff that's from inside this will become visible to other people. Do that right at the end. Nicolette up next with the question about the jurisdiction and stuff. I'll put you on audio, Nicolette. Just frame your question for us.
Yes, there's two bits about this, because one is around the participation and wanting to make sure that people are included right from the outset in the discovery phase of what the wellbeing factors or whatever it is around place. And the reason I refer to a story of place process in the question, as this is something which is people are moving on from sustainability to sort of regenerative sort of living systems thinking, approaching to this, have found that actually the story of place process is a way of doing that and making sure that it is actually, you get that contextual granularity and you get the a much richer set of perceptions than you'll get if you're just talking to anchor institutions. So that's the sort of background to my question, although the question could just be a yes or no answer.
Jemma.
So it kept breaking up for me there, so apologies. So was the question about how much kind of, is it wider participation rather than just...
Shall I answer it, Jemma? Because I think I might know the answer to this one.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
I think the answer, Nicolette, is, and nice to talk to you again. I mean, we know each other from Henry Lewis and Gore days, don't we?
Yeah.
I think the answer is the framework would encourage a specific HWNS conversation with a specific area to set that context for their particular conversation, as opposed to try and do it generically for the entire country. So buried deep down in what Jemma finished talking about, the facilitation package, there's a question of, well, how do we now design the intervention? What is the base we have to give people? And it may include, you know, what is the shared history in this place across these different domains of health and well-being and nature and anything else relevant to the thing, so that you then go into that discussion with some knowledge of what happened in the domains that aren't your home domain in the conversation. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it's obviously, it's not a question you can answer it in a minute or two, but at least I've asked it.
Thank you very much. Right, let's pop you off for a moment. We have a couple of anonymous ones, so I can't invite you to voice the answer. The next one down, Jemma, is, does the framework embed any objectives or principles, or is it more the case of just showing the interconnections and the specific objectives in the planning exercise are set by the participants, by the local team?
Yeah, no, it doesn't embed any a set of principles. Obviously, as Paul's touched on, that the facilitation framework that we are currently finalising does take people through a set of steps in terms of getting them to think about their kind of focal questions that they're asking, their geographical context, their kind of social context for that HWNS conversation. So that takes it through a process, but when it doesn't have a set of specific principles in it, no.
The next two, and we only have a couple of minutes left. The next one, will the factors be labelled according to local authority functions and interests so users can see which relate to theirs and other roles? Jemma, that sounds to me like well, you could put an overlay on it. You haven't done it yet, but you could put an overlay on it of these relating to different local authority nodes. I don't think it's something you've done yet, but it theoretically could be.
No, it isn't something we've done yet. I mean, partly because although local and combined authorities were that initial primary ordinance and still are, but I think very aware of trying to keep it quite broad in terms of placemaking, so recognising that local and combined authorities have a big role in that. So there's kind of anchor institutions, but they're not the only ones. So yeah, not wanting to make it too specific to that primary audience. So no, we haven't done it, but again, it could be something that is a potential future possibility if it was felt to be useful and needed.
We're just a minute from the end. We'll pick up the last two questions, I think, in
Okay.
some kind of summary response afterwards, Jemma. Though there are answers to the last two questions, I feel. Just for the last minute, Jemma, thank you so much first for doing all this, and thank you to all attendees for joining in and being with us this afternoon. Jemma, can you give us just in the final minute what happens next?
What happens next? So, like I said, we have got some funding for Beta, which is great because we've gained an awful lot of information and learning over the last year. So we'll be taking that into this year. Ideally, we are working towards autumn in terms of being able to have certain elements kind of public, if you like, and available on the website. But in between now and then, we've got our core pilots, but we've also got other local authorities that are interested in trialing and testing it. So we'll be pulling together the whole package to really be able to then test that out in full with a view to having a more public launch, fingers crossed, later this year.
Very good. So I think we close now. Thank you so much to the people who've attended. We hope to see you again on other CECAN webinars of interest to you. Thank you to Jemma for putting in all the effort and spending the time with us to present it. And we hope to see you all again very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.